Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a conversation about challenges and opportunities facing cities through the view of Mike Froman. Mike, thank you for joining us. You have had not only obviously a successful career, but a really interesting one. You've touched a lot of different points in the federal government, in the Clinton administration, the State Department, Treasury. Then you went to the private sector, Citigroup, then came back, and the Obama administration eventually became the U.S. trade rep. Now you're back in the private sector with MasterCard. What brought you back, particularly as it pertains to what you want to do with and for cities?
Well, the glib answer of what brought me back to the private sector was that there was an election, so I needed to find a job. I think the deeper answer is that when I was in government, and for example, working on our development policy around the world, it became painfully clear to me that there wasn't enough foreign assistance or philanthropic money in the world to solve the kinds of problems that we all wanted to try and solve, and that unless we could get the private sector involved, not just from a philanthropic perspective, not just from a corporate social responsibility perspective, but in terms of aligning their business models and bringing their technology and expertise to the table in their interest, if we could get that involved with having meaningful, commercially sustainable social impact, that was going to be the key to solving these challenges. And when it came to cities, I think cities are really where this really comes to the fore, with all, as this audience knows better than anybody, with the great trends towards urbanization, and 70% of the global population, 80% of global GDP likely to find themselves in cities by 2050. That's where a lot of these issues are going to come to the fore. And at a time when governments, at least national governments, are polarized and somewhat paralyzed from action, it puts even more pressure on cities and the private sector to try and find solutions. Well,
this next question is just completely bound up in this moment in which we're living in the United States. Does this nationalist streak becoming evident here, certainly in other parts of the world, how does it change what mayors and other city leaders might be trying to do in their communities?
You know, I think what we're seeing here in the United States, but as you said, also elsewhere around the world, whether it's Europe or Latin America or parts of Asia, is that on one hand, there's been tremendous economic growth over the last several decades, and it's lifted hundreds of millions, if not more than 1 billion people out of poverty. Really one of the most successful periods of human history. On the other hand, the benefits of that growth haven't always been shared as broadly as they could have been, and a lot of people feel like the system isn't working for them, that they're being left behind, and we see that evidence itself politically in rising populism, nationalism, protectionism.
Creating the other.
Creating the other. It's much easier to sort of blame the other than to say, okay, our national governments need to actually address some of these important domestic issues. I think all of that points to the fact that, again, at other levels of government, whether it's governors or mayors, and in the private sector, we need to find ways of addressing these concerns. And that's why bringing together mayors and other people from from cities to try and figure out how to work together to address that is all the more important. And focusing particularly on how do we make sure the next several decades of growth is really about inclusive growth, making sure that the benefits are broadly shared. And as cities become even larger and more urbanized, that we're addressing, from an equity point of view, how that urbanization takes place.
Inclusive growth. My guess is that it means something different to many people in the audience here. What does it mean to you, and particularly in the Center for Inclusive Growth, of which you're the chair of the board?
Well, MasterCard's had a Center of Inclusive Growth for the last 5 years or so, and it's really been focused on both of those words, that growth is very important. We need to make sure we keep our eye on how do we help promote economic development. In our case, how do we use our data, for example, to help mayors and others think through their economic development strategies and attract the kind of investment they're looking for to address the challenges of distressed areas. But also about inclusiveness and making sure that individuals have an ID, that they're recognized, that they're able to participate in the financial system, and that it's not just giving them access to the financial system in terms of having an ID, an account, a capability of interacting. It's actually helping them on the path towards financial security. So the first step is, and it varies from country to country and city to city, making sure that they have an identity. Secondly, that they can get access to the financial system. But thirdly, that they can begin to save, begin to perhaps buy insurance or invest, get financial literacy training for gig workers in the United States, shared economy participants, being able to manage what is now a very uneven income stream so that they understand what they need to do to be able to save for a rainy day, how to manage benefits in a system where we don't have employer-provided benefits to the same degree that other countries do, how to get access and make sure that those benefits are portable.
Can you get a little bit more granular and give us an example of where a project is playing itself out, and also where there's been failure and what kind of lessons are learned from that?
Well, look, I think we've tried, for example, to use our data with the city of Chicago to understand the purchasing power of a poor neighborhood, the Pullman neighborhood, and how that purchasing power can help drive retail investment into that neighborhood and the spillover effects of that investment for the economy as a whole, job creation and other economic activity. We've done similar projects with Baltimore and New York City and Providence and others to look at how do we use our data in a way that has positive social impact. Not every experiment will be successful, and I think one of the benefits of this kind of gathering, and we have a group of cities that we work with in a grouping called City Possible, where each city takes on a challenge, whether it's ID or managing tourism, and tries to find solutions for that, and then shares the solutions with the other cities in the network. And we learn from each other's successes, and we learn from each other's failures. And I think that's part of making sure we're playing our role in convening some of the most interesting ideas in this area.
What are the common factors you find in leaders where there is success in some of the projects you've launched?
I think where we found partners who are committed to innovate and willing to take on challenges in new ways. I think one of the things we're very focused on is the emerging data divide between the private sector with all of its strengths and its access to data and data scientists, and the public and social sector on the other hand, which may not have access to the same resources the private sector does. How can we help those leaders who want to use their data, want to understand their data? How can we help provide them with the kind of support they need to be able to address the challenges they face? I mean, the great thing about mayors and cities is that they're focused on everything from broad economic development strategies to filling potholes and making sure the garbage gets collected and the snow gets removed
and getting reelected
on time and getting reelected. And so being able to help them develop those capacities, I think, is a key role for the private sector to play. And I think what's very important is that philanthropy is absolutely critical, and corporate social responsibility is absolutely critical. But to really get scalable solutions, companies need to figure out how to use their technology, their products, how to tweak their business models to actually align their commercial interests with having social impact. And that, to me, is the ultimate expression of what the role of the corporation should be. Delivering, obviously, great financial results for their shareholders, but at the same time, being fully committed to aligning their business with social impact. That's what we're trying to do. We're experimenting with a lot of different ideas there, whether it's our technology to get access to credit for small and micro merchants, or our ID efforts, or our efforts to work with cities to help them reform their transportation system.
I know you think that transit is ripe for innovation.
Absolutely.
Why and in what ways?
Well, I take it in two different ways. One is there's still an immense amount of inefficiency and cash used in the transit system. People missing their buses, missing their trains because they're waiting in line to buy the special cards and fumbling with cash and the like. We worked with the City of London, the tube system, so that now you can pay contactless with whatever card is in your pocket. We're now working with over 100 other cities around the world to try and do that. It saved the City of London, by the way, more than £100 million a year that they can now put towards health, education, housing, or other critical needs. I think the other piece of it, though, is that, again, as cities become even larger and more congested, looking at mobility as a service, and how do we help, as we did, again, with Chicago, in helping manage congestion. Using our data, using our infrastructure to be able to send messages and incentives to commuters to wait 15 minutes before they try to get from place A to place B, or to take a different route. And in one experiment, I think 18% of the commuters changed their commuting because it saved them time, saved congestion, improved the quality of life in cities. And to me, that's the ultimate goal that we're all trying to achieve.
Let's talk about small business for a moment, because that is a source in some cities of so much employment, hopefully stable employment, and yet when hard economic times come, it's often the small businesses that feel it the most. So how should city leaders think about how to support small business?
I think every city, every country in the world that I've traveled to believe that small business is really at the core of their economy, and that it is the job creator and the backbone of their economic potential. I think the challenge oftentimes is making sure those small businesses have the tools they need to grow and to expand, one of which is credit. And so, for example, in several cities around the world, we're working to digitalize the relationship between a micro merchant and their supplier, meaning so that in places where there don't exist credit ratings, to be able to see the interactions between a micro merchant and the company that supplies them, so that a bank can then go in there and say, I can see that this merchant buys $1,000 worth of stuff, they sell it for $1,500 a month, they're a pretty good credit risk, I'm willing to give them a loan. That's financial inclusion. That's bringing not just individuals, but micro merchants into the financial system. I think and
how does it extend that to the idea of how that helps protect them in hard times?
Well, I think it makes them more resilient financially. I think oftentimes what we're finding is that small businesses are right on the edge of success or failure. And what they, in the world of small business, cash flow is king. Knowing exactly what you've invoiced for, what you've been paid for, where the payments are coming from, how to be paid efficiently. We came out with a product last month called Mastercard Track. We built with Microsoft and several others that makes it much easier for small businesses to become part of supply chains. To upload themselves and be vetted to be part of global supply chains. Makes it much easier for companies to manage the risk of their supply chains, and then gives total visibility into the payments flow. That's all about making it possible for small businesses to participate in the global economy better, but also making it much cheaper, much more efficiently possible for companies to manage those relationships. You
mentioned the global economy. I cannot have the former U.S. trade rep on this stage without asking you this question about how city leaders should be thinking about tapping into potential for global trade. So often it seems out of reach.
Well, when I was the U.S. Trade Representative, I loved working with mayors and governors, because they totally got it. And regardless of their political affiliation, they saw on the ground how important it was for their companies to be plugged into the global economy, to have access to other markets. We're never going to have the kind of well-paying jobs we want to have here in the United States by just selling products to ourselves. We need to have access to the 95% of the world's consumers that live outside the United States. 80% of the purchasing power is outside the United States. And I have always found mayors to be at the forefront of leading trade missions on behalf of their companies to other countries, of being out there trying to attract investment of foreign firms into their cities, because they understand more than just about anybody how critically important it is for our economy to be integrated with the rest of the world. Obviously, it's got to be fair trade, and there are lots of different ways of going at that. But mayors, I think, can play an absolutely critical role, both in promoting their own companies and promoting their cities as a destination for investment, but also for speaking out about the importance of international engagement and the importance of continuing to show U.S. leadership on the global stage in terms of opening markets and creating fair rules of the road.
And during this time of upheaval, when you think about the status of trade agreements the U.S. is
I don't know what you're talking about.
I know. Can mayors still do what you just described, or are we in a holding pattern?
No, I think they can. I think what we've seen in a lot of different areas is even as the national government has taken a somewhat different approach, mayors have reached out to their counterparts in other countries. They have led delegations. They have spoken out. In fact, if anything, they've sort of doubled down on the need to keep their cities at the forefront of the global economy. And I mentioned City Possible, this network we have of cities all around the world. Certainly one of the dynamics there is that these mayors and these cities understand more than anybody just how important they are to the global economy and what role they can play in making sure that that economy stays on firm footing.
And a good note on which to ask all of you to join me in thanking Mike Froman for a good conversation. Thank you.